The banking clan intimidates debtors, seizes property on defaulted loans, and funds both sides of a galaxy-wide war. Thank God we live in a more civilized age. That's the setup. Here's the proof. 22 years before the Battle of Yavin, a Muun named San Hill signs his name to a document on Geonosis. Muuns are a species built like someone stretched a human over a wireframe. Tall, pale, elongated skulls. The physical embodiment of a species that evolved to look expensive. San Hill is the chairman of the InterGalactic Banking Clan, the single institution that controls the majority of the galaxy's financial infrastructure before the Clone Wars begin. Not a majority of Separatist financing, not a plurality of regional lending, a majority of galactic finance, full stop. Planetary governments borrow from the IGBC. Trade routes depend on its credit systems. Its interest rates function as monetary policy for an entire civilization spanning thousands of star systems. And San Hill just signed the Confederacy of Independent Systems into existence. The treaty he signed was, in the canonical record, explicitly non-exclusive. The Wookieepedia article states it in plain terms. San Hill personally committed his forces to the Confederacy of Independent Systems in a non-exclusive pact that allowed the banking clan to profit from both ends of the war by serving the Republic as well as the Separatists. The canon article is more understated. The banking clan continued to conduct business with the Galactic Republic during the Clone Wars, but the substance is identical. An institution that had just pledged its military forces to one side of a galactic civil war was simultaneously providing financial services to the side those forces were fighting. Both sides, same institution, same war, simultaneously. The interest rate architecture is where the arrangement stops being ambiguous and starts being a design. Separatist clients received loans at zero interest. The Republic's rates were raised. The documentary record uses the phrase "jacking up the interest" on Republic loans to compensate for what the IGBC was subsidizing on the other side. The government fighting for its survival was paying premium financing costs to the same institution bankrolling the army trying to end it. The war was a product the banking clan sold to both customers at differential price points, with the unfavored client's rates cross-subsidizing the preferred one. A non-exclusive arrangement, conducted openly, with both parties presumably aware of the other's existence. Nobody in the Galactic Senate appears to have called this treason. The banking clan called it standard business practice. By the time the Clone Wars animated series reaches its Season 6 story arc, the arrangement has generated exactly the institutional corruption you'd expect from an organization that has spent years financing both sides of an active conflict. The Rush Clovis arc follows the banking clan's leadership being exposed as corrupt, Rush Clovis elevated as a reformer, Clovis immediately framed by Count Dooku, and Clovis killed as the institution gets absorbed into the Republic state apparatus. The structural pivot at the center of the arc is the Deregulation exchange, a transaction so on the nose that a group of academic scholars published an entire chapter analysis of it with the title taken directly from the in-universe dialogue. The title is, "To ensure the safety of the Republic, we must deregulate the banks." That's not editorial commentary, that's a line from the show. The Clone Wars writers put that sentence in a character's mouth, in that order, as the explicit justification for a wartime banking policy. They knew exactly what they were writing. The exchange works like this. The Republic, midway through a war it can't afford to lose, and increasingly can't afford to finance, needs emergency credit. The banking clan offers new loans. The terms require regulatory deregulation of the banking clan itself in exchange for access. A government fighting for its survival, with no viable alternative lender at galactic scale, accepts. It trades the legal authority to regulate its primary financial institution for access to that institution's credit during a war. Chancellor Palpatine then uses the revealed corruption and wartime urgency as grounds to federalize the banking clan entirely, bringing the IGBC under direct Republic control, then Imperial oversight after Order 66. By the end of the Clone Wars, the institution that funded both combatants throughout the conflict is nationalized by the government that won. It then continues operating through the Empire, through the Galactic Civil War. Two galactic governments collapse around the InterGalactic Banking Clan, and the Banking Clan remains operational through both transitions. The institution outlasted the political claims of every regime that tried to either use it or contain it. There's a comment thread that surfaced a detail at significant engagement, a claim that certain planets had been promised, or effectively transferred, to the Banking Clan from thousands of years prior, predating any government currently claiming sovereignty over those systems. There's no established canonical basis in the available lore for that specific multi-millennial territorial claim, and it should be treated as speculation. But the instinct behind it points to something the actual lore does confirm: debt that outlasts the governments that incurred it, and creditor claims that survive regime change. The IGBC surviving both the Clone Wars and the Galactic Civil War isn't a multi-millennial territorial saga, but it does demonstrate that the institution's claims on the financial system outlasted the political claims of every regime that came after. Some things are apparently too essential to dissolve. Padme Amidala makes the sharpest political diagnosis available in the prequel material. Her argument, repeated across the Senate scenes in Attack of the Clones, isn't the standard critique that corporations are corrupting government. That reading is too simple for the distinction she's actually drawing. Her precise claim is that the Separatist crisis represents corporations that have stopped lobbying governments and started replacing them. A corporation that buys a senator is still operating within a political system. It's using financial power to influence political decisions, which means politics still exists as the framework in which both parties are operating. A corporation that fields a battle droid army, signs treaties with planetary governments as a co-equal party, funds both sides of a galactic civil war through a documented, non-exclusive pact, and continues operating through every subsequent regime change. That corporation isn't operating within a political framework. It's one. That distinction is the thesis. Everything else is evidence. Now, the part of the Separatist megacorporation story that even dedicated lore viewers apparently didn't know, because when it surfaced in the comments, it was described as hilarious and account fraud by someone who had just correctly named BlackRock, JP Morgan, the World Bank, and the IMF from memory. Both characterizations are accurate. Both are underselling it. James Luceno's 2012 novel Darth Plagueis, Legends Continuity, reclassified as non-canonical after Disney's 2014 EU reorganization, establishes the Sith Master's civilian identity as Higo Damask II. Species: Muun. Homeworld: Muunalanced. Professional role: Magister within the InterGalactic Banking Clan. His business entity, Damask Holdings, occupied what the novel describes as one of Harnaden's most magnificent super spires, for more than 50 years prior to the events of the prequel films. He is described in the novel as a revered member of the InterGalactic Banking Clan. Not a member, a revered one. 50 years of institutional credibility, built while secretly being the most powerful Sith Lord alive. He isn't peripheral to the IGBC. He shapes its direction from within. The novel establishes that Plagueis tutored Sand specifically in preparation for Sandhill's ascension to the clan chairmanship. The man who signs Dooku's treaty in Attack of the Clones, who pledges the non-exclusive war financing pact, who sits on the Separatist Council, he was installed in that position by a Sith Lord who needed the banking clan positioned as a tool of Sith long-term planning. Damask Holdings used the IGBC's infrastructure to finance significant portions of the Sith plan, including the secret Clone Army Commission on Kamino. The institution that would fund both sides of the Clone Wars had its chairman placed by the Sith Master who designed the Clone Wars. And Palpatine inherited all of it. When Plagueis died, killed by his apprentice, as Sith tradition apparently requires, Palpatine acquired access to the financial infrastructure Plagueis had spent decades constructing within the IGBC. The Clone Army on Kamino, financed through Damask Holdings and IGBC channels, was already in production. Sand Hill, groomed by Plagueis, was already positioned for the chairmanship. The non-exclusive pact that would fund both sides of the war was signed by a chairman whose career had been built by the Sith, financing an army that the Sith had already paid for, generating revenue from both sides of a conflict the Sith had designed from the beginning. At some point, this stops being account fraud and starts being a business model. The specific claim from the brief that Darth Bane stole from the Banking Clan Army Fund, initiating the chain, that precise mechanism isn't confirmed in the available canonical or legend sources. What the Luceno novel does establish is the Plagueis to Palpatine financial inheritance chain through IGBC control. The embezzlement framing is accurate for what Plagueis and subsequently Palpatine were doing, using an institution's financial infrastructure for purposes the institution's legitimate stakeholders would presumably object to, while maintaining the appearance of institutional membership in good standing. The structure is the same regardless of where it originates. Sith operatives embedded inside the galaxy's central banking institution, directing its resources toward goals the institution would never have formally authorized. This is, to be clear, also just a thing that happens. The Techno-Union operates from a fundamentally different position than the Banking Clan, but arrives at the same endpoint through a different door. Where the IGBC's power derives from controlling access to credit, the Techno-Union's leverage comes from controlling access to technology. Wat Tambor, foreman of the Techno-Union, Separatist council member, represents an industrial confederation of technology-producing corporations whose products are embedded throughout the galaxy's advanced systems. The Techno-Union's position in the Separatist alliance is that of a defense contractor who got ambitious. The corporate alliance, the Commerce Guild, both followed a recognizable pattern. Private economic entities that controlled enough infrastructure, enough production, enough trade flow, that the line between economic participation and political participation had blurred past the point of meaningful distinction. The Commerce Guild controlled supply chains significant enough that withholding cooperation constituted an act of economic war. The corporate alliance managed enough commercial infrastructure that its alignment determined which side of the conflict had functional trade access. All four institutions arrive at the Separatist Council through the same logic. They aren't rebel idealists. They aren't political actors with ideological commitments to independence from the Republic. They are corporations that calculated, correctly, that the Confederacy of Independent Systems offered a more favorable regulatory environment than the Republic Senate's oversight mechanisms, and that the war created leverage they could monetize from both sides simultaneously, either through the IGBC's explicit non-exclusive structure or through the simpler mechanism of being the entities whose cooperation determined which side could manufacture, finance, and move. The Separatist Council on Geonosis isn't a gathering of revolutionaries. It's a board meeting that happened to start a war. Theodore Roosevelt understood this architecture 70 years before George Lucas put it on screen, and he spent his presidency trying to dismantle it. By 1901, when Roosevelt took office after McKinley's assassination, Standard Oil controlled somewhere between 70 and 90% of U.S. oil refining capacity. The Northern Securities Company, J.P. Morgan's railroad holding company, had effectively merged the Great Northern and Northern Pacific Railroads into a single entity controlling rail access across the American Northwest, allowing it to set freight rates for the entire agricultural output of the region without competitive constraint. Both entities existed because they had grown large enough that the distinction between economic power and political power had become theoretical. Roosevelt's first annual message to Congress, delivered December 3, 1901, addresses the corporations directly. Great corporations exist only because they are created and safeguarded by our institutions. He wasn't arguing that corporations were inherently evil. He was arguing that their scale derived from legal structures that governments had created, and that the same governments retained the authority to modify those structures when corporations had grown large enough to threaten the political system that sustained them. This wasn't a popular argument in 1901. The Northern Securities case reached the Supreme Court in 1904. The court ruled 5-4 to dissolve the holding company, one of the closest antitrust decisions in American legal history, decided by a single vote. The Standard Oil dissolution came in 1911, when the Supreme Court ordered the company broken into 34 separate entities. Roosevelt had filed the original suit in 1909, during his final years in office. Standard Oil became 34 companies. Rockefeller owned approximately 25% of Standard Oil before the dissolution. After the breakup, the combined value of the 34 successor companies grew substantially. The stock price of the component entities rose as the market valued each piece separately. Rockefeller's total wealth appears to have increased after the dissolution of the monopoly, whose dissolution he had fought against. The antitrust action that was supposed to reduce Standard Oil's power had, by one measure, made its primary shareholder richer. The companies that had been separated eventually began reacquiring each other. Standard Oil of New Jersey and Standard Oil of New York merged in 1966 to form Mobil. Mobil merged with Standard Oil's direct successor Exxon in 1999. The entity that became ExxonMobil had reassembled a significant portion of what the 1911 Supreme Court had broken apart. Roosevelt's antitrust crusade wasn't ineffective. The Northern Securities dissolution was a genuine constraint on railroad monopoly power in the short term, and the Standard Oil breakup did reshape the oil industry's competitive landscape for decades. But the pattern TR identified in 1901, corporations that exist only because governments create and sustain them, growing large enough to threaten the governments that created them, didn't resolve with the dissolution orders. It recurred. The corporations found new structures. Padme would recognize the dynamic. It's what she's describing in the Senate scenes. The Separatist megacorporations didn't emerge from nowhere. They grew within the Republic's legal framework, under the Republic's commercial regulations, sustained by the Republic's institutional infrastructure, until they were large enough that the Republic couldn't simply dissolve them without losing the financial, technological, and commercial systems that the same corporations controlled. At that point, the question of who serves whom becomes genuinely ambiguous. The banking clan doesn't lobby the Republic Senate. It sets the Republic's borrowing costs. The techno-union doesn't advocate for favorable regulations. It manufactures the components that determine whether the galaxy's advanced systems function. The Commerce Guild doesn't donate to political campaigns. It controls the supply chains. The corporate alliance doesn't hire consultants to influence trade policy. It manages enough commercial infrastructure that trade policy without its cooperation is largely theoretical. George Lucas, speaking at Cannes in 2005, confirmed that the prequel trilogy's political allegories were intentional, that the parallels to real-world power structures were deliberate design choices rather than coincidental resonance. The research confirms that the in-universe dialogue itself carries this framing explicitly. To ensure the safety of the Republic, we must deregulate the banks isn't a scholar's reading of the subtext, it's the text. In the year 2000, the IMF was operating structural adjustment programs with explicit water privatization conditions attached in 12 countries. 8 of those 12 were in sub-Saharan Africa: Angola, Benin, Guinea-Bissau, Honduras, Niger, Rwanda, Tanzania. Each required privatizing or transferring control of water infrastructure as a condition for financial access, not a suggestion, a condition. The Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy documented the specific conditionality language in each agreement. These were called poverty reduction programs. The conditions required reducing government capacity to provide water and electricity directly to citizens. Both things were true simultaneously, in the same loan documents, signed by the same governments that had no functional alternative to signing. That's not metaphor, that's the mechanism. The banking clan's non-exclusive pact isn't a more aggressive version of this. It's the same structure with lightsabers in the margins. Goldman Sachs in 2006 and 2007 sold mortgage-backed securities to clients while simultaneously holding positions through credit default swaps that paid out when those same securities collapsed. The Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations documented that the firm generated billions in profit from the housing market's failure. Subcommittee Chairman Carl Levin stated on the record that Goldman's conduct was deceptive and immoral. Goldman settled with the SEC in 2010. The IGBC charged the Republic premium rates to cross-subsidize its interest-free separatist loans, structuring its financial exposure so that both directions of the conflict's outcome generated return simultaneously. The specific instruments differ. The design principle, arrange your exposure so the outcome doesn't determine whether you profit, does not. BlackRock's Aladdin platform tracks risk across more than $20 trillion in assets. The U.S. federal budget in 2023 was approximately $6 trillion. Aladdin operates government advisory contracts, some awarded without competitive bidding. The revolving door between BlackRock and government economic advisory positions has been documented by multiple analysts. The firm generated $289 billion in net new client assets in 2023. At that scale, the distinction between advising a sovereign government and being embedded in its decision-making infrastructure is difficult to locate precisely. The IGBC doesn't lobby the Republic. It provides the Republic's financing and sets the terms. BlackRock doesn't lobby governments in the conventional sense. It advises them, manages their assets, and operates the risk infrastructure those governments rely on. Scale creates peer relationships. The title is an overstatement in the specific details. It's precise in the structural dynamic. The four separatist megacorporations, the InterGalactic Banking Clan, the Techno-Union, the Commerce Guild, the Corporate Alliance, aren't a collection of rebel idealists who decided to oppose the Republic on principled grounds. They're a board of directors that calculated the war was good for business and structured their participation accordingly. The IGBC funds both sides explicitly through a documented, non-exclusive arrangement, while a Sith Lord's former protege sits in the chairman's seat. The Techno-Union supplies the military technology that makes the conflict possible. The Commerce Guild and Corporate Alliance control enough commercial infrastructure that the war's economic logistics run through their systems, regardless of which side wins any particular battle. The Separatist Council doesn't meet to plan the liberation of the Outer Rim from Republic overreach. It meets to manage the return on investment from a war that its members structured to generate profit, regardless of outcome. Padme's argument is that this isn't corruption in the conventional sense, senators being bribed, regulations being purchased, officials being co-opted. Her argument is that the separatist crisis represents corporations that have passed through corruption and come out the other side into something structurally different. Entities that have become the governance function, not actors trying to influence it. The IGBC doesn't need to corrupt Republic financial regulation. It sets interest rates. That is the financial regulation. The distinction Padme draws between buying government and becoming government is the exact distinction that the non-exclusive pact, the Plagueis-installed chairmanship, the deregulation for credit wartime swap, and the post-war nationalization then continuation arc all demonstrate at varying levels of explicitness. Roosevelt drew the same distinction in 1901. He called it the difference between corporations that exist within democratic institutions and corporations that have grown large enough to threaten those institutions from within. His solution was antitrust enforcement. It worked partially, temporarily, and the pattern recurred anyway. The Northern Securities Company was dissolved in 1904. Standard Oil was dissolved in 1911. ExxonMobil formed in 1999. The IGBC survived two galactic governments and continued operating under imperial oversight and beyond. Dissolution orders and the institutions they target don't always resolve in the expected direction. The comment that earned 234 likes, named BlackRock, JP Morgan, the World Bank, and the IMF, unprompted, in a Lore Videos comment section, with zero apparent irony. The comment that earned 79 likes wrote, "The banking clan intimidates debtors, seizes property on defaulted loans, and funds both sides of a galaxy-wide war. Thank God we live in a more civilized age." Both comments were correct. The lore makes the argument. The real-world institutions are the punchline. The audience already knew the joke before the video started. They just wanted someone to confirm they'd heard it right. They had. If you want more of this, the lore that turns out to be a description, the fiction that reads too much like a document, subscribe. New scripts drop regularly, and the source material keeps providing.